Henry Paulson came out a week ago warning about the potential for a sovereign debt crisis and a catastrophe for the U.S. Treasury market. So, who is Henry Paulson? What is a sovereign debt crisis, and why does this matter? Henry Paulson, who also goes by Hank Paulson, is a true bankster. He was an investment banker with Goldman Sachs for decades, eventually becoming the CEO of Goldman in 1998 until leaving in 2006 to become George W. Bush's Secretary of Treasury. As Treasury Secretary, he would serve throughout the Great Financial Crisis, push through the bailouts, and threaten banks to participate in the recovery or face retaliation from the government or the Federal Reserve System. Here's an old news clip of Paulson being grilled by Congress about misleading them regarding the TARP bailout.
Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson traveled to Capitol Hill armed with optimism.
I think we've turned the corner in terms of stabilizing the system, preventing a collapse.
But that wasn't nearly enough ammunition to face down angry House Democrats.
You, Mr. Paulson, took it upon yourself to absolutely ignore the authority and the direction that this Congress had given you. Just amazes me.
They'd been waiting to grill Paulson since he announced last week the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, wasn't going to buy up troubled assets, all those bad mortgages, after all.
It was an extreme change and rather shocking.
But use the money instead to inject cash into banks.
It seems to be the second largest bait and switch scheme that history has ever seen, second only to the reasons given us to vote for the invasion of Iraq.
Paulson said he changed strategy once it became clear that loosening up a frozen credit system was the single most important factor in steadying the economy.
When the facts changed and the circumstances changed, we changed the strategy. We didn't implement a flawed strategy. We implemented a strategy that worked.
But the House members hammering Paulson said they sold the program back home as a way to help people out of bad mortgages.
I hope that you understand the pain and the suffering of so many homeowners in this country that are losing their homes.
Democrats are now getting behind an FDIC mortgage relief program. Sheila Bair, a Bush appointee who runs the agency, is pushing for $24 billion of TARP money, which she says could prevent 1.5 million foreclosures over the course of the next year. Jim Axelrod.
So that was Henry Paulson attempting to justify how they redirected the bailout funds from specifically targeting the troubled assets, the mortgages, to directly injecting the funds to certain banks. And you can dismiss all the political grandstanding by the Democrats in that clip because they're in on it too. A perfect example of that is that Maxine Waters, who is featured in the clip, feigning her outrage over the bailout, when her husband, Sidney Williams, his bank, One United, received approximately $12 million in bailout funds. Maxine Waters, who is also still in Congress today. But following the bailouts, Henry Paulson, Ben Bernanke, Geithner, and others have been hailed as saviors for preventing a collapse, which is misleading. All they really did was kick the can down the road and dig the hole deeper. Now Paulson is warning of a sovereign debt crisis. Now, essentially a sovereign debt crisis is when a government loses its ability to service its debt or its inability to find a way to finance that debt. This is what it would look like. First, investors begin demanding higher yields to compensate for rising fiscal risk. This is talking about Treasury bond investors. So let's say the U.S. government wants to issue bonds, which is how they borrow money to finance their spending. They will hold a bond auction and investors will demand a higher yield, meaning a higher interest rate to offset the inflation risk or the opportunity cost involved in purchasing the bond. Now, the higher yields increase the government's interest payments, which widens the deficit. And we're already having a problem with our interest payments, as the government is currently spending approximately $88 billion a month on interest payments alone. Now, this annualizes out to over $1 trillion a year in just interest payments. In 2025, the entire federal government revenue was $5.2 trillion. That means almost 20% of the revenues will go to interest alone. So if bond investors demand a higher yield on their bonds, This will push our interest payments higher, increase the debt service cost. And unless the government reduces its spending, will further increase the deficit, which leads to the final leg of Paulson's doom loop, which is the wider deficit will make investors more nervous, which will drive the yields even higher. So the fear in the bond market will cause investors to demand higher yields, increasing the cost for the United States government. And just to clarify, when you hear people talking about the Fed lowering interest rates, this is different from rates on treasuries. The only interest rate the Fed directly controls is the Fed funds rate, which can influence short-term treasury bills, but not typically longer-term bonds. So essentially what Paulson is warning is that bond investors will demand higher yields, which will be unsustainable for the United States government. And that's if we can even find investors for these bonds. You see, the U.S. relies heavily on foreign investors to buy our debt, and unless you haven't been paying attention, the Trump administration has been straining our relationships with everyone from Europe to Asia. And this is on top of the de-dollarization trend that we've already been seeing as foreign governments and central banks have been reducing their holdings of U.S. treasuries. The article continues to note that Paulson addressed this same concern when he said, when you hit the wall and you're trying to issue treasuries and the Fed is the only buyer and the prices of the treasuries are going down and interest rates are up, that's a dangerous thing. He's talking about demand in the treasury market eroding and the Fed stepping in to become the lender of last resort or the purchaser of last resort. Debt monetization. Basically, exactly what they've done through quantitative easing and their other bond buying programs, only in this scenario, it could be as the rest of the world is dumping their dollars and treasuries, and the dollar could lose its status as world reserve currency. When pressed on the timing of the crisis, Paulson admitted it's impossible to know. He said, people say, when are you going to hit the wall? I obviously don't know. It's impossible to know. When we hit it, it will be vicious. So we have to prepare for that eventuality. So his message is that the timing is impossible to know, but investors should understand the risk is structural, not theoretical. Basically, if things don't change, it's not a matter of if, but when. The frustrating thing is this warning is coming far too late. This is the exact same warning that free market economists have had for years and have been even more vocal since this same Henry Paulson pushed the bailouts in 2008. Peter Schiff, Ron Paul, economist at the Mises Institute, and many other Austrian economists have been warning of this for years. The fact that the Treasury and the Fed have been able to keep up the charade for this long is impressive. Real free market capitalists criticized the bailouts because it prevented the necessary correction that could have led to a real recovery. Failure and correction are one of the most important features of capitalism, which is why the bailouts are only further proof that we don't actually have a capitalist system. Now, yes, it would have been much more devastating at the time, but as bad as things were in 2008, we never got close to having the real correction needed to undo all of the malinvestment and risk in the markets that was driven in large part by the low Fed rates following the dot-com bubble bursting. And the quantitative easing programs pushed by Bernanke also failed. When Bernanke was accused of monetizing the debt, he said this was different from debt monetization because their bond purchases were only temporary, and they would clear off their balance sheet once the economy stabilized. Well, it's 18 years later, and they were never able to clear off the treasuries from the Fed's balance sheet. It actually has only gotten worse. And this is why the entire Obama recovery was false. This is why when Trump came in 2016 and cut taxes, but didn't cut the spending, and he increased the deficits, the problems were never really fixed. I can't remember how many arguments I had with Trump supporters during his first term by pointing out that none of the necessary structural changes were made. The only thing that changed was the perception of the markets. But we've been dismissed for years, labeled as alarmist, pessimist, and perma-bears. I can remember warning people about the BRICS alliance in 2010, and people were acting like I was crazy. You know, the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and they've actually, now it's expanded to include multiple other countries. But now, over the last several years, even the mainstream media and others can't help but acknowledge that the BRICS alliance actually has some real global power. Now, Paulson goes on to follow up on his warning with a very optimistic take. He said, "There is good news. We're a rich country, and so there's plenty we could do if we begin to act." He says it's going to take increased revenues, taxes, and dealing with expenses. I love how he says this like it's an easy task. You know, if it's so easy, why didn't they get things under control while the debt and deficits were increasing under Bush? Trump was reelected in 2024 to get the budget under control and rein in government spending. Then he pushed the big, beautiful bill and its big, beautiful deficit of $1.7 trillion. So why should Americans be optimistic? These are supposed to be the fiscal conservatives. Our politicians continue to prove time and time again they lack the political will to make the painful and necessary decisions to get the American economy back on a sustainable course. This warning could be coming far too late anyway. Or maybe I'm just being pessimistic. What do you think? Do you agree with Henry Paulson that with some political will and a good emergency plan that the U.S. government can correct course and save the Treasury market and the dollar? Or do you think our politicians will continue to push irresponsible fiscal policies and bring about the sovereign debt crisis? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment.